It was a busy day at the community market. People moved around, buying and selling goods, chatting and laughing as they went about their daily tasks. The air was filled with the smell of fresh produce, spices, and roasted corn. Among the crowd was Nkechi, a proud and beautiful young woman. Nkechi was known for her flawless skin, elegant outfits, and confident walk. She believed she was better than others because of her looks and often judged people based on their appearance. As Nkechi walked through the market, her eyes scanned the crowd. She sneered at those she thought looked poor or unkempt, her head held high. Suddenly, Ikenna, a man with a simple and humble look, accidentally bumped into her while carrying a bag of vegetables. Ikenna was a quiet man with an unassuming presence, but there was something mysterious about him that people couldn't quite place. Nkechi turned to Ikenna with anger. "Can't you watch where you're going?" she snapped. She looked him up and down, her voice full of mockery. "Maybe if you dressed better, you wouldn't look like a beggar." Ikenna apologized politely, but Nkechi wasn't satisfied. She continued to insult him, raising her voice so the crowd around them could hear. Some people laughed, while others felt sorry for Ikenna. He stood quietly, listening to her harsh words. Before walking away, Ikenna looked at Nkechi and said calmly, "You never know who you are talking to." The crowd murmured as they watched Ikenna leave. Nkechi, feeling proud of herself, shrugged and walked off, thinking she had put Ikenna in his place. Little did she know, her words and actions that day would come back to teach her an important lesson. Nkechi was known in her village for her beauty and confidence, but she also had a reputation for looking down on others. She believed that a person's worth was measured by how they looked or dressed. Nkechi always made sure she wore the finest clothes and jewelry, often spending more than she could afford just to maintain her image. To her, appearances were everything, and she judged anyone who didn't meet her high standards. She loved to show off in public, walking with her head held high and her nose slightly in the air, as if the ground wasn't good enough for her. Many people in the village admired Nkechi for her boldness. Her friends would laugh and clap whenever she made cutting remarks about others, even though some of them secretly disagreed with her. They didn't want to speak up because they feared Nkechi's sharp tongue. Behind closed doors, a few of her friends admitted to each other that Nkechi's behavior was too much, but they never said it to her face. There were many times when Nkechi had humiliated people in public. Once, a young girl who sold vegetables in the market accidentally spilled water on Nkechi's dress. Nkechi had yelled at the girl so loudly that everyone in the market turned to watch. "Do you know how much this dress costs?" Nkechi had shouted, pointing at the girl with disgust. "Someone like you can't even afford to look at it, let alone ruin it." The girl had apologized over and over, but Nkechi didn't stop until the poor girl ran away in tears. Another time, an elderly man had asked Nkechi for directions. Instead of helping him, she had laughed and told him to ask someone who looked like him, mocking his old torn clothes. The man had walked away silently, his face full of sadness. Nkechi didn't feel bad. Instead, she told her friends about the incident later, and they laughed about it together. Nkechi's obsession with appearances also affected her relationships. She refused to associate with anyone she thought wasn't good enough for her. If a person wasn't wealthy, good-looking, or well-dressed, she had no interest in talking to them. She believed that being around low-class people would ruin her reputation. Despite her harsh attitude, Nkechi saw nothing wrong with her behavior. She believed she was just being honest, and she enjoyed the attention and admiration her boldness brought her. But what she didn't realize was that her arrogance was slowly driving people away, and even some of her closest friends were starting to lose respect for her. It was another busy day at the community market. The stalls were crowded, and people moved around, bargaining and chatting loudly. Nkechi walked confidently through the market, her fine dress catching everyone's attention. She held her head high, scanning the crowd as if she owned the place. Suddenly, Ikenna, a humble-looking man carrying a sack of vegetables, accidentally bumped into her. The sack slipped from his hand, spilling a few tomatoes onto the ground. Nkechi stopped and turned to him with anger written all over her face. "What's wrong with you?" she shouted, her voice echoing over the market noise. "Are you blind or just stupid?" She looked him up and down, sneering at his simple attire. "No wonder you can't see where you're going. With clothes like that, you must be too poor to even buy proper shoes." Ikenna bent down quietly to pick up his tomatoes, murmuring an apology. But Nkechi wasn't done. She crossed her arms and continued, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "People like you don't belong in places like this. You're just an embarrassment." Some people in the market laughed at her words, nodding in agreement, while others stood in silence, uncomfortable with her behavior. As the crowd gathered, whispers spread. Some people admired Nkechi's boldness, saying, "That's just Nkechi. She speaks her mind." Others frowned, shaking their heads in disapproval. An elderly woman in the crowd muttered, "Pride always comes before a fall." Ikenna stood up, holding his sack of vegetables. His face was calm, showing no anger or frustration. He looked at Nkechi and said in a quiet but firm voice, "You never know who you are talking to." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving the crowd behind. For a moment, Nkechi stood there, confused by his words. But she quickly shrugged it off and smiled smugly, thinking she had won the argument. She walked away, still feeling proud of herself, while the crowd slowly dispersed. Some people whispered about Ikenna's strange response, wondering what he meant, but most went back to their business. Nkechi, however, didn't care. To her, Ikenna was just another nobody who wasn't worth her time. She couldn't have known that this encounter would change her life forever. After the incident at the market, Nkechi met up with her group of friends. They had heard about how she confronted Ikenna and couldn't stop praising her. "You really showed him," one of her friends said with a laugh. "People like that need to be put in their place." Another added, "That's why we love you, Nkechi. You're not afraid to speak your mind." Nkechi smiled proudly, enjoying the attention and approval from her friends. To her, it was proof that she had done the right thing. However, not everyone in the market shared the same opinion. A group of elderly women who had witnessed the incident shook their heads in disapproval. One of them, Mama Ada, approached Nkechi as she walked past their stall. "My daughter," Mama Ada said in a serious tone, "you should be careful how you treat people. Pride can lead to your downfall." Another woman added, "You don't know who that man is or what his story might be. Karma has a way of teaching lessons to those who think they are above others." Nkechi rolled her eyes and walked away without responding, dismissing their words as the ramblings of old women. Meanwhile, Ikenna was spotted at another corner of the market. He was helping an elderly vendor whose cart had tipped over, spilling her goods onto the ground. Ikenna knelt down and carefully picked up the fruits and vegetables, arranging them neatly back in the cart. The old woman thanked him repeatedly, calling him a kind soul. "Not many people would stop to help these days," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. Ikenna simply smiled and continued to assist her until everything was back in place. Some people who saw this couldn't help but compare Nkechi's behavior to Ikenna's. "Did you see how he helped that woman without complaining?" one man whispered to his wife. "And yet Nkechi called him useless," she replied, shaking her head. Word of Ikenna's kind act began to spread, and a few people started to wonder if Nkechi had been too quick to judge him. But Nkechi didn't care about what others thought. She was too busy enjoying the praise from her friends and basking in her own sense of superiority. Little did she know, the seeds of her downfall had already been planted. The next day, Nkechi sat with her friends under a big tree near the market, talking about what had happened with Ikenna. She couldn't stop bragging about how she had put him in his place. "Did you see how everyone just stood there watching me?" Nkechi said, flipping her hair proudly. "That's what happens when you mess with someone like me." Her friends laughed and cheered her on, saying she was the boldest and most beautiful woman in the village. Nkechi soaked up their praise, feeling more confident than ever. Later that day, a wealthy-looking man arrived at the market. He wore fine clothes and gold jewelry, and his presence immediately caught everyone's attention. Nkechi's eyes lit up as she saw him step out of a fancy car. "Now, That's the kind of man I deserve, she whispered to her friends. Without wasting time, she adjusted her dress and walked gracefully toward the man, pretending to browse the nearby stalls. She made sure to stand where he could see her, smiling sweetly and hoping he would notice her beauty. At home that evening, Nkechi's family tried to talk to her. Her mother, a wise and gentle woman, said, "Nkechi, my child, beauty is not everything. You should learn to treat people with kindness and humility." Her father nodded in agreement, adding, "Don't let your pride lead you down the wrong path. Respect everyone, no matter how they look." But Nkechi didn't listen. She rolled her eyes and said, "You don't understand. People respect me because I'm confident and beautiful. That's how the world works." Her younger brother chimed in, "But what about Ikenna? He seems like a good man. Maybe you judged him too quickly." Nkechi scoffed. "I don't need advice from a child," she said dismissively. "Besides, someone like him will never matter to someone like me." Nkechi continued to focus on her appearance and ignored her family's warnings. She spent hours perfecting her look, believing that her beauty would open all the doors she needed. The wealthy man from the market had already become her new goal, and she was determined to catch his attention. To Nkechi, humility and kindness were weaknesses, and she refused to let anything or anyone stand in her way. But her arrogance was leading her toward a lesson she would never forget. A few days later, Nkechi received an envelope delivered by a young boy from the city. The envelope was fancy, made of thick paper with golden edges. Inside was an invitation to a grand event at the city's most prestigious venue, known as the Crystal Hall. The invitation mentioned a gala night hosted by a well-known philanthropist, with many important and wealthy guests expected to attend. Nkechi's eyes widened with excitement as she read the invitation. She couldn't believe that someone as important as her had been invited to such a high-class event. "This is it!" Nkechi exclaimed to her friends, holding up the invitation for them to see. "I've finally been recognized for who I am. My beauty and charm have earned me a place among the elite." Her friends cheered for her, telling her she deserved it. Nkechi was already imagining herself walking into the grand hall, dressed in the finest gown, with everyone turning to admire her. She felt like she was destined for greatness. When Nkechi showed the invitation to her family that evening, they were less enthusiastic. Her mother furrowed her brows as she read it. "Nkechi, you need to be careful," she said gently. "Not everything that looks good on the surface is good for you. Sometimes things aren't what they seem." Her father agreed. "You don't even know who sent this invitation. How can you be sure it's safe?" But Nkechi didn't want to hear any of it. "You people always worry too much," she replied, waving the invitation dismissively. "This is my chance to shine. I'm not going to miss it just because you're afraid of everything." Her younger brother looked at her and said, "Just don't let your pride get you into trouble, Nkechi." She laughed and shook her head. "Don't worry about me. I know what I'm doing." Over the next few days, Nkechi prepared for the event as if her life depended on it. She borrowed the most beautiful dress she could find and spent hours making sure her hair and makeup were perfect. To her, this invitation was proof that she was special, someone who belonged in the world of riches and luxury. She ignored her family's warnings and focused only on how she would look and the impression she would make. Nkechi was certain that this night would be the beginning of her rise to greatness. Little did she know, it was the start of a lesson that would change her life forever. The evening of the event finally arrived. Nkechi stepped out of the car she had hired for the night and stood in awe in front of the Crystal Hall. The building was massive, with sparkling lights and tall glass doors that reflected the glow of the chandeliers inside. Expensive cars pulled up one after another, and elegantly dressed guests stepped out, each looking more impressive than the last. Nkechi smiled to herself, confident that she belonged among them. As she walked into the hall, her eyes widened even more. The inside was even more breathtaking than she had imagined. Golden decorations covered the walls, and the floors were so polished that they looked like mirrors. Tables were set with the finest dishes, and waiters in crisp uniforms carried trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. A soft melody played in the background, adding to the atmosphere of elegance. Nkichi felt like she had stepped into a dream. She moved through the crowd gracefully, making sure to smile at everyone she passed. Nkichi loved the way people glanced at her, some even nodding in admiration of her beauty. She felt like a queen, and her confidence grew with every step. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Nkichi saw a familiar face. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized it was Ikenna, the man she had insulted at the market. But this wasn't the Ikenna she remembered. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, and he looked confident and composed. Around him were several influential-looking guests, laughing and chatting with him as if he were one of them. Nkichi froze for a moment, shocked to see him there. How is this possible? She thought to herself. It must be a coincidence. Maybe he's just lucky to be here. She quickly shook off her surprise and continued walking, determined to enjoy her evening. She convinced herself that Ikenna was probably a guest of someone important, and that it didn't matter. Nkichi focused on mingling with the crowd. But she couldn't help glancing at Ikenna now and then, wondering why he seemed so comfortable among the rich and powerful. For the rest of the night, Nkichi tried to ignore the uneasy feeling growing in her chest. She was there to impress people and make connections, not to think about some simple man from the market. Yet, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't completely forget the sight of Ikenna standing there, surrounded by people who clearly respected him. Something about it just didn't add up. But Nkechi wasn't ready to face the truth. Not yet. As the evening went on, the guests gathered in the main hall for the highlight of the event. A man stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone to get everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a smile, "thank you all for coming tonight. It is my honor to introduce the man who made all of this possible, our host and the owner of this beautiful venue, Mr. Ikenna." Nkichi's eyes widened in disbelief as Ikenna walked up to the stage. He looked confident and poised, his suit perfectly tailored and his presence commanding respect. The crowd erupted into applause, and people stood up to cheer for him. Nkechi felt her knees weaken as the realization hit her. Ikenna, the man she had mocked and insulted at the market, was not only wealthy, but also the owner of this grand venue. On stage, Ikenna smiled warmly and spoke to the audience. "I want to thank each and every one of you for joining me tonight. This event is not just about celebrating success. It's about giving back to the community and helping those in need." His voice was calm and genuine, and the crowd listened attentively. He shared stories about the charity projects he supported and the people he had helped, and the room filled with admiration. Guests around Nkechi began whispering to one another. "He's so humble despite his wealth," one woman said. "He's truly an inspiration," added another. Nkechi felt a mix of shame and confusion. How could she have misjudged him so badly? The man she thought was beneath her was now being praised as a role model. As the applause died down, Ikenna stepped down from the stage and began mingling with the guests. Nkechi tried to avoid him, hoping he wouldn't notice her, but it was too late. Ikenna walked up to her with a calm expression. "Good evening, Nkechi," he said politely. "It's nice to see you again." Nkechi's face turned red with embarrassment. She struggled to find the right words. I didn't know," she stammered, but Ikenna gently interrupted her. "You didn't know who I was, and that's okay," he said. "But you should remember that how you treat people matters, no matter what they look like." His words stung, but they were true. Nkechi felt a deep sense of regret as she realized how unfairly she had treated Ikenna. She wanted to apologize, but the lump in her throat made it hard to speak. Ikenna smiled softly and said, "I hope tonight gives you something to think about." Then, he walked away to greet other guests, leaving Nkechi standing there, speechless and full of shame. Nkechi stood frozen for a few moments, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to apologize to Ikenna, but she couldn't find the words. Her pride had been crushed, and she felt embarrassed in front of everyone. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she gathered enough courage to walk over to Ikenna. "Ikenna," she said softly, her voice shaky. I'm so sorry for what I said to you. I didn't know who you were. I was wrong to judge you based on your appearance." Ikenna turned to face her, his expression calm. He nodded, as if he already understood.